Today marks the first lecture that we're going to be looking into genetics. But before we can get into that, we have to understand some of the basics of genetics, such as what's dominance, recessive, and probably the most important, what exactly is a trait. First, let's look at the definition of what a genetic trait is. Introduction to genetics. What is a trait? A trait is a term used in genetics to describe something that is visible in an organism. Whenever we describe a person's features, we're actually describing their traits. For example, if they have brown hair color, we would be saying they have a brown hair color trait. Blonde hair color would be the blonde hair color trait. Everything you see is a trait, from your eye color to height, what goes into height, bone structure. Even your weight can be dependent on traits. Personality has also been factored into genetic traits, as well as our interests have been linked into certain types of genetics. Animals use their traits in terms of fur and other visible things. Anything you see on an organism is a trait. What are the types of traits? Gregor Mendel observed traits in pea plants and found that certain traits would show up over others in offspring. These are simplified terms, however, that we're going to use. Gregor Mendel was a monk living quite a while ago. He found that certain pea plants would inherit certain traits, so he began to crossbreed them and found that depending on the parents, certain peas would get certain traits depending on them. Sometimes the traits wouldn't show up, and sometimes the traits would show up. Every so often as well, the traits would skip generations. These are the laws of modern genetics that we use today. He classified traits into two groups. There were dominant traits and recessive traits. Dominant traits. A dominant trait are ones that are more readily shown than other traits. Example, a brown eyes parent and a blue eyes parent have a child with brown eyes. We would say that brown eyes are the dominant trait. When we think of dominant traits, it's easy to see it in skin color, such as children typically inheriting darker skin color when one of the parents is darker skinned and the other parent is pale. Once again though, simplified terms. Let's take for example this couple here. She has brown hair and he has blonde hair. They decide to have a kid. The kid ends up with brown hair. We would say that brown hair then is a dominant trait to blonde hair. Recessive trait, a trait that is not as readily shown when compared to other traits. For example, a brown-furred rabbit and white-furred rabbit make the babies have brown fur. We would say that white fur is recessive to brown fur. So now that we understand the definitions of dominance and recessives, now we can get into, well, how does it that genes begin to go to one another? I mean, are they dependent on each other or are they completely separate? It turns out that they are completely separate of each other. This is called the law of segregation. Let's take a look. What determines which trait is passed? Every organism has two sets of chromosomes, one from mom and one from dad. These are the chromosomes that make up the human body. Notice they come in pairs. Once again, one from mom and one from dad. During meiosis, the chromosomes split and go into individual sperm and eggs. In meiosis, after crossing over, the chromosomes are divided and sent to different sperm and eggs. Only one trait is given to each sperm and egg, regardless of if it's dominant or recessive. This leads us to the law of segregation. It can also be known as the law of segregation. Law of independent assortment states that the chromosomes will separate completely from each other. Usually won't end up with both mom and dad chromosomes for one trait in a sperm or an egg. The law of independent assortment also allows us so that way our genes don't get mixed up in some sort of weird way. For example, regardless of if your hair color is brown and your eye color is green, they will end up randomly going to different sperm and eggs. They're not dependent on each other. This leads into the great amount of diversity you can have as people, with sharing traits from your mom, dad, or more than one or more than the other. This is all hingent on the law of segregation. It also makes sure that you don't end up with eyes growing up on your hands.